The Bible as a Handbook for Understanding Self. Part 5. By Shane Miller. Prophets and Priests. The narrative of man as contained in the Bible shows a pattern of continual error and fall in consciousness. In the final analysis, this had the effect of bringing man to the point where he became a slave to his own creations and his environment, a victim of the illnesses of his body and of accident-proneness. Limitations in the functions of body, mind, and spirit became his normal condition. Of himself man could do nothing, probably for the same reason that the sick man finds it difficult to imagine himself in any condition other than his present one. His instrument of regeneration, his mind, is below par too. If help were to come from man, it would have to come from above, and even this possibility was finally lost sight of. Limitation became compounded. Certain men born into the world throughout the ages, seemingly gifted with insight and possessed of a sense of responsibility for others, attempted to rouse the sleeping prodigal, man. This was done in many ways, through exhortation or prophecy, through the chant, the dance of ritual itself. These certain men, whom we call prophets and priests, sought to rouse man to God consciousness, to awaken him to his glorious past, turning his mind toward regeneration and revival and bringing him into full realization of his destiny as co-creator with God. Seemingly they were as steadfast in trying to carry out their function as the people with whom they worked were unstable. This was a never-ending job, and they are to be honored for their persistence. The two roles. What is the essential difference, one might ask, between a prophet and a priest? Certainly both are men of God, but whereas the priest finds an honored place in his community, the prophet has been stoned and beaten probably more often than he has been listened to. Let us define a priest as a man who has been chosen by his group or tribe to represent the people to God. He has been chosen to make intercession on behalf of his flock. The prophet, on the other hand, is a man chosen by God to represent him to his people. The selection, it would seem, comes from above, and neither birth nor rank, rule nor logic, has much to do with it. The clearest Bible story dealing with the means by which a prophet is selected and developed is probably the story of the boy Samuel. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, had long yearned for a child, without result. She finally promised that in return for a son she would give him to the church, or to God. When the child was born, Hannah offered him in service to Eli, the high priest at the temple, to be raised and trained by him. Samuel awoke one night at the temple hearing his name called, or so he thought. Quickly he ran to Eli and asked if the old priest had called him. When Eli denied calling the boy and instructed him to return to bed, Samuel obeyed. 3 times the action was repeated. 3 times Samuel went to Eli in response to Eli's call, as he thought. Eli, by the 3rd time, had begun to sense what had happened, so he said, "Go, lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth." From this day on, Samuel was a prophet of Israel. As such, it was Samuel's duty, as the Lord unfolded his plans to him, to warn the people against present procedures or else indicate the pressures of coming disasters. Another story about a prophet actually confronting a priest, not as a co-worker but from the opposite side of the fence, is that of Amos. Amos, the prophet, faced Amaziah, the priest, almost as an opponent. At this particular time Israel had fallen on evil days and was in rather bad shape. There were 2 kingdoms instead of one, Israel and Judah, and they bickered back and forth. Amos was told what was going to happen and was instructed to inform both kingdoms. Even the surrounding peoples would be affected. Being a herdsman, Amos came into Bethel, where the king's chapel was, to give his message directly to the people themselves, not to the priests. He was probably hot and dirty from his travels down from the hills, and in his goatskins, with his sunburned face and windblown hair, made a rather rude appearance. While he was talking, the people gathered around him, outside the chapel or temple, his strident tones carried inside to Amaziah, the high priest in charge. Amaziah, doubtless a very elegant person, handsomely garbed in his rich robes of ritual and rote, looked out to see who was disturbing the peace. The sight of such a rude fellow, roaring his wild-sounding words of warning, pained Amaziah greatly. He stepped out to put a stop to it all. "O thou seer, go, flee thee away into the land of Judah," he said, "and there eat bread and prophesy there, but prophesy not again any more at Bethel. For it is the king's chapel, and it is the king's court." Everything had been running so smoothly here at Bethel, Amaziah probably was thinking. All the ceremonies and rituals in the temple had been going according to rule and regulation, and now this fellow had to come along. To listen to this Amos, one would gather that the chapel, so beautifully managed, had somehow lost most of its worship of God. What an idea! And what an insolent rustic! But Amos answered with the truth, as he understood it. "I was no prophet," he said, "neither was I a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a gatherer of sycamore fruit, and the Lord took me as I followed the flock. Mind this, took me," he said, "chosen, like Samuel, and the Lord said unto me, Go prophesy unto my people Israel." As Amos faced the elegant Amaziah, who stood in such sharp contrast to himself with his wild exterior, we see Amos symbolizing for this brief moment in history the mission of Israel to the world. To be a channel through which the Creator could remain in touch with all His children. Here, too, is the archetypal situation, the heart speaking out against the empty mechanics of the intellect. The mind talks of the expedient thing to do, the heart tells the right thing to do, and in the soul of every man Amaziah and Amos seem to stand face to face constantly. This is not to say that the priest is always in opposition to the prophet. Both are needed. Let us look for a moment at the priest's function. His people have chosen him to represent them before God, as we have pointed out. This means that he has the trust of the people and he must never mislead or betray them. He must question all new situations as they turn up, even the prophet when he appears, since there are such things as false prophets. As elder brother to his flock, he must ever be aware and alert. While the priest does not usually have the mystic insight of the prophet, his own function nevertheless is very important. Most devout people realize this. Consequently, the seminaries are turning out priests and ministers and rabbis, to be custodians of the very knowledge which the old prophets and mystics have channeled into the world, as well as consultants for the hopes and dreams and longings of their people. The factor of complete sincerity in such a calling must be of the essence. The priest's responsibilities to his flock, therefore, by a strange paradox, add another hazard, another obstacle for the prophet. For he, the prophet, being chosen by God, bears no outward sign of his calling, carries no sheepskin or diploma to declare his qualifications. All he has is the still small voice within. He, the prophet, comes to take the spiritual temperature of his people and their times. Being more sensitive than most, he may react violently to questioning and ridicule, and when the encounter is over he may find himself covered with bruises or a fugitive, in a strange land, his life in danger. The fleeing prophet is almost an archetypal figure. Yet the world has great need for its prophets. Old Testament prophecies. To return to the biblical prophets of the Old Testament, we find the prophet often seemingly a protected man. He is fed and maintained in his crises at most unlikely physical sources. At times he seems to control the elements, and often he is a channel of healing. Elijah, Elisha, Daniel, and many others are examples of this. Wonderful and interesting as these stories of their miracles are, however, the most important function of these old mystics was to herald the Messiah to come. Since man throughout the ages had been constantly falling into matter and getting lost, since all his creations, his institutions and tools had a way of turning on him like Frankenstein monsters, his rescue would have to come from above. The Greeks tell the story of Prometheus, bound to a rock in such a way that he was completely helpless. Each day an eagle alighted upon him and consumed his liver, the seat of life in the body as assigned by the ancients. At night the organ grew back again, only to be consumed again the following day. Prometheus, it seemed, had stolen fire from heaven, and the gods had chained him to the rock as punishment. A little dream interpretation applied here can quickly bring out the message contained in this story. Prometheus is the symbol of man attached to his earth. Of himself he can do nothing. The eagle, symbolizing man's own mental activity, indicates that his struggles and tensions merely exhaust him. Only through rest and sleep can man be restored and his energies, his life, his liver, replaced. As the process keeps repeating this pattern of daily attack and nightly regrowth, Prometheus is not getting anywhere nor making any permanent accomplishments while chained to his rock. Hope enters the story at the precise point where Prometheus dreams of hearing a voice telling him that he will be rescued by a god, who will come from above. It will not come about by his own powers. This is also the story of man, as told in the Old Testament. The Hebrew symbology is different, the names vary and the locale, perhaps, but in substance the story is the same. The Hebrew sources, however, are much more detailed in their prophecies of the Messiah, the God to come from above. Isaiah tells us that the Messiah would be born into the family line of David, of Jesse's stock. He would not engage in war or conquest. His purpose would be to establish justice among men. Other nations would come to this beacon for guidance and arbitration, and through him the regeneration of all peoples would come about. He would be known as the Prince of Peace. Jeremiah supports this, and Ezekiel tells of a spiritual Messiah as well as a political one for Israel. Haggai's viewpoint is that of a Messiah chosen by the Lord of hosts who will take over the world after all temporal institutions have been destroyed. These prophets also tell of the restoration of Israel in a political sense, that there was to be a homeland for the scattered tribes. The fulfillment of this prophecy we can watch taking place in our own day. Ben-Gurion, the Israeli leader, consulted these old prophecies constantly, and when in power, acted on them as facts. Jesus the fulfillment. When the Messiah arrived, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, it was plain that this was no ordinary prophet. He had godlike attributes. He was in such command of himself that he could command his environment, could quiet the waves of Galilee as he controlled the tempests within his own emotional nature. He could and did prophesy. He could and did heal. He possessed knowledge that confounded the sophisticates of his day. He had universal wisdom, not the least of which was a full knowledge of his purpose, his mission in the earth. Here was, in truth, the perfect example of the completely evolved man. Yet, like the prophets of old who had foretold his coming, He was sharp with the priests and the experts of that day, who tried to trap him with their verbalizations. His scorn of their system of values was clearly expressed. Prophets are painful to listen to. They interfere with and upset good lucrative enterprises like the money changers' tables in the temple. And the weight of truth which they bring has a nasty way of sweeping away orderly systems of empty ritual, as Amaziah found. And so, this man had to go. This also Jesus foretold and made every preparation to withdraw from the scene as his persecutors decreed, by whatever methods they prescribed for anyone who dared to run against institutionalized thinking. He would do this and demonstrate to all the world that a man could die a shameful and unjustified death and cherish no resentment, no enmity. He was also to demonstrate that it would be possible for the fully evolved man to raise and move about a body exhausted and full of grievous wounds, and in it, return to his former companions in their old haunts. And then, before witnesses, he would ascend by an act of divine will, this time to lay aside the body to await his return at a future time, and with a prophecy that would be the one to end all prophecies, that he would come as they had seen him go. Nor was this the last. There was a sequel. A series of miracles followed in the lives of those who had known him. There was the Feast of Pentecost, with its tongues of flame and gift of tongues. There were healings and revelations. And with the coming of Paul into the picture, with the strange story of his experience on the road to Damascus, new implications in the life of Jesus were unfolded. The disciples had certainly not forgotten the Master's words when he said, upon one occasion, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." This demonstrated Jesus' identification of himself with any and every human being in the world. What must have been the amazement at hearing Paul's story, in which the voice of the Master, whom Paul had never seen and towards whose followers Paul, as Saul, had been a vicious enemy, had sounded in Paul's ears. "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" There it was. Not only had the Master identified himself with every human on earth, but he was in the heart and mind of each one, literally. He could reach out and take over any creature, any soul he wanted at any time, friend or foe, saint or sinner. Nothing could hold these men back now from their mission. There were no barriers to restrain them, no hardships too great, no enemy too fierce, no trial too extreme. And later, men and women they had touched, and future generations would spring up to carry on the same work, suffering hardship and torture even as he had. Until the whole Western civilization as we know it would be colored by his words and deeds. Whole systems of law would be founded on his teachings and on those of Israel. For the early Christians discovered, as we must rediscover for ourselves today, that as this Christ consciousness is developed within us, the prophet will come to life again. There will be a resurrection of the Son of Man in us, and by overcoming all barriers within as he did, we shall learn to truly love again, and in loving become strong enough to be gentle. What should be the supreme result of this? The sleeping prophet within us all, awakening, would move toward the priest within. At the same time, the priest would move toward the prophet. No longer would they be opposed, as were Amos and Amaziah. Blending in what is later spoken of as the marriage of the bride and the Lamb in the book of Revelation, the priest intellect would merge with the human heart, the prophet, forever.